Welcome. I made a mistake with the date yesterday. Yesterday was the 21st of Av, not the 22nd, and it was the 25th of August, not the 26th. And today is the 22nd of Av and the 26th of August. And we just started chapter 17, and we talked about voice versus speech. So that is the unification of Za and Malchus, meaning the small countenance, Tiferes, and its feminine counterpart, the kingdom. Where do we see this, for instance, coming up in Rosh Hashanah? In Rosh Hashanah, when we blow the shofar, the shofar is considered to be a kol. It's going to be a sound, a voice. And when you said voice, we said there's your voice, and then what you say. To find your voice is one thing, to be able to speak is another thing altogether. So for instance, when we look at the shofar, so the shofar is just a simple sound. There's no complexity in it. You can only stop and start it. That's all you can do. So that's considered to be a kala pnima, an inner voice. Kala. Kala in Aramaic is kol. Kala pnima. Yeah, with the kuf. So, there's a lot to be said about what the exchange you made, but in any case, it's like a writer who, in order to express himself, has to find his voice. The voice is internal. It's not something that you know about before you start speaking. So a child who's learning how to speak is only learning the external aspect of speaking. And it can be many, many years, maybe 60, 70 years, before a person can find their inner voice. That's something completely different. So, if you don't have an inner voice and you're just speaking, so these are relatively empty words. We say that they don't really come from the heart. And when it comes from the heart, we're saying that your inner voice is being expressed. So the shofar is the sound of the inner voice of every person. It's not yet the complexity of speech, but it's the inner voice. It's like the stance that I have. So the kavanot, all the intentions around the shofar, are all very internal. They're very much like, how are you standing before Hashem on Rosh Hashanah? What does it mean to stand before Hashem? So this famous story that the Magid every year would, this is with the Baal Shem Tov actually, he would teach the kavanos to someone. And one year his regular shofar blower wasn't there, so he had to teach it to someone new. And he asked him, so what do you have in mind when you blow the shofar? So he said, what I have in mind is that I have nothing to say, and that the only thing, and I'm standing in front of a closed door, and the only thing I can do is take a hatchet, try to break it down. So the Baal Shem Tov said, okay, I don't need to teach you any kavanos. You have the right attitude. The voice is like your stance. It's your intention. It's your inner stance, the way you're standing versus the world. So that's the masculine part. The feminine part is how you're actually expressing it, how you're actually saying it. Okay. And we said then that any kind of maturity of the inner voice of Za, the small countenance of every partzuf, but particularly Za, has to do with mind, receiving the mind, receiving the brain. Amochin, chokhmah v'bina v'dat kidilel. So we're in the fifth line. Ulefichach tzich lamshich tchila b'chinat amochin. So what does it mean to bring first of all mind into this whole voice thing, this whole inner aspect of my heart? What does it mean to have mind there? So the way to explain this is to use a parable of a person who wants to learn some great wisdom. When they say wisdom, they mean something like medicine. That was usually the example. You want to go and become a surgeon, a doctor. It used to be the surgeon and doctors were the same thing. Today they're split almost everywhere in the world. V'amashal והמשל הזה, ואי אפשר לו ללמוד החוכמה עד שילמוד תחילה לשון שמדברים בו החוכמה. So if you wanted to go and learn medicine, you first had to learn Latin. If you don't know Latin, you can't understand all the medical terms. So there's no point in going to study medicine if you don't know what the instructors are going to be speaking about. You don't understand their language. Distal, proximal, all these things, if you don't know what that means, what does distal mean? So if you don't know, it means the further away. Arachok. Yeah. So okay, so it doesn't matter how you learn.
All the pre-med guys took etymology.
Right. They have to.
Yeah. Right.
So if you, otherwise, if you took Latin, so you know Latin, so it's very easy. Even then it's not easy because there's also a lot of terms in Greek. But if you don't know the language, you can't. Let's give another example. A person wants to become a Talmid Chacham. He wants to become a scholar in Torah. You can't do it if you don't understand the language of the Talmud. I'm not talking about everything else. First of all, to understand the language of the Talmud. There's a lot, just to even understand this. There's this famous story that I heard once, that Rav Avadia Yosef, he said once that before he started learning, he went over, he called it, before I really started learning, he went over the Shas a number of times, until he felt that the language of the Shas was his language. Until he felt that the language of the Talmud was the language that he spoke. And if you can't do that, then you're not in the element. You can't understand the whole thing. You have to understand the language. And it also is a great wisdom to learn the language. But in the end, it's only a vessel in order to reach the goal, which is becoming a surgeon, becoming a scholar. This should be put over every single yeshiva, every single shul in the United States, and in England, and everywhere the Jews live, and in Israel. This sentence. What does this sentence say? You cannot learn the written Torah, you cannot learn the oral Torah without first knowing Lashon HaKodesh, without first knowing Hebrew. And we're not talking about the Hebrew, the modern Hebrew. That's why I said you have to put it over every shul in Israel also. Because you have to know biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, a little bit of what there is Talmudical Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Rishonim. You have to know that language. Now, you see many very well-meaning people, and not just well-meaning, but also very God-fearing, who are handicapped and have no business teaching because they don't know Hebrew. It's one of these terrible things. If you don't dream in Hebrew, you can't teach Torah. Period. There's no exceptions to it. It just doesn't work because this is the language of Torah. In the same way that I can't be a Supreme Court justice and understand how to relate to cases that are constitutional without knowing English. If you don't understand English, if you don't dream in English, if you can't live in English, you can't understand the Constitution. You can't rule on these things. It has to be ingrained. And so there's many, many well-meaning people who simply don't know Hebrew, and they talk nonsense, complete nonsense. And that includes me in some ways. He says, even though I know Hebrew, I dream in Hebrew, and so on. But it's still things that I don't know about the grammar, things I don't know about, they're an impediment to what I say.
Oh, it's endless.
It's not endless. It's not endless. All the great scholars, first of all, learned Hebrew. The Rambam, the first thing he learned was Hebrew. The Ramban, the first thing, and you see their Hebrew. You see their Hebrew. This was not a language that people spoke. And they write better than I write.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Because for them, this is the language. If you can't internalize it, you can't speak about it. But again, let's leave that aside. Even just well-meaning people. I have a lot of friends in Crown Heights. They're very nice people. And here, it's not a question of they're saying nonsense or not. They know their limits. But they don't realize how many of their limits are because they don't speak Hebrew. So much of it. These are people who would be geniuses in Torah, but they cut themselves short by not investing time in Hebrew. This especially happens to Baalei Tshuva, who come late. They come late, and so they're stuck.
Look at my struggle.
Yeah.
You see me
There
struggle.
is not the problem. The problem is every issue.
That's what they said. Every single yeshiva is.
Struggle is still not
Yeah,
so much.
yeah, right.
You see, I'm struggling with the
Right.
essence of this every day.
So Rabbi Ginsburg used to say to people in Kfar Chabad, there were a few Americans there, and they divided into two groups: the ones who had assimilated, who became Hebrew speakers and got along with the regular population. Okay, so their Hebrew is not perfect, but they don't need to think; they speak, and they write. And the ones who stayed in the American enclave, in the English-speaking enclave, and they stayed behind. They got lost. They never... Coming to Eretz Yisrael is not about living in Eretz Yisrael only. It's also about picking up the language. But I said it's a problem with modern Hebrew speakers also. They don't necessarily know Hebrew in depth enough. But in any case, it's necessary, he says. אי אפשר ללמוד חוכמת התורה שבכתב ושבעל פה בלתי שילמוד תחילה חוכמת הלשון הקודש. Person cannot learn Torah without first of all knowing the wisdom of the language of Hebrew. So it's not just speaking, it's also understanding the grammar, understanding how it works. ועל דרך משל זה יובן שזהו עניין המשכת המוחין לזון. שעל ידי זה...
It's a depressing concept, but yes.
No, you cannot let your life pass without doing it. Don't speak Hebrew at home.
You want to have a good chinuch from the kids.
Yeah.
Speak them in Hebrew.
Right. Like the same way that my kids are angry at me that I never spoke I never spoke English to them. Because for me, English is too...
English was the same complaints. Not this. I know, there is one guy, David Feldman.
Yeah.
His wife is American. Usually you speak with the kids. The language with the wife.
Yeah.
He put in only because of this, his kids knows how to learn.
Yeah. שעל ידי זה יוכלו להגיע אחר כך לקבל הארת האור אינסוף הנמשך להם מאבא ואמא. So that's what it means to bring down the language of the mind. Whose mind? The Abba and Ima, the father and mother, the Chochma and Bina. They're the ones who have to bring down their language, like you just said. It's what the parents speak with the children. The parents have to speak a certain language with the children. So here we're not saying it's like a family. We're saying like inside each person. My parents, my wisdom and my understanding have to speak to my heart. What does that mean, for instance? So I'll give you, I was thinking about this morning before I came here. I think that one of the big problems that we have today is that we have pretty much given up on truly separating the good from the bad in ourselves. It's so hopelessly mixed that it's not like I'm going to be a person whose character is 100% good. I'm always going to remain some kind of mixture. And so I can't count on my instincts because my instincts are always mixed. In Tanya, I learned one simple principle. So I learned one simple principle of what makes a good person, what makes a not a good person. What's he doing it for? Who's he doing it for? If I'm doing it for myself, I'm suspicious of it. And if I'm doing it for others, then it's probably okay. But that's the main differential. Who am I doing this for? And when I look at myself, and I look at everything I do during the day, even teaching, I love being here. Why do I love it? Because it's for me. I enjoy it. I love teaching. It's one of my problems. Why is it a problem? Because I'm doing it for myself. It's not like somebody came to me and begged me, "Oh, please, we have to hear you." I have teachers who were like that. The people came to them, Amish begged them. And when the Rebbe became the Rebbe, he didn't stand in line. He didn't and say, "Oh, pick me." It was like completely the opposite. The last thing in the world he wanted. But people forced him. Rav Eliyahu had this prayer that he used to carry around in his wallet that came out after he passed away. he was appointed to be a judge in the courts at age 27, 29, something like that. It was late 20s. And in his prayer he said, "You know, Hashem, that I didn't want this, and that I was forced into this. And so I beg you that every time that I have to try a case, you stand with me and give me the wisdom to try it properly." So there's people who do things because they're forced into it. Whether they enjoy it later or don't enjoy it later, that's a different question. But they were forced into it because there was nobody better. So people saw this and they said, you should be it. So unfortunately, most of what I do is because I want to do it. Nobody forced me into it. So I'm very suspicious of myself. Why am I doing it? So what do I need? I need to have my father and mother, my wisdom and understanding, to differentiate between what I should be doing and what I shouldn't be doing. Meaning, out of all the things that I want to do, I have to have some kind of intellectual criteria by which to choose which one is good, in spite maybe of the fact that I enjoy it. Despite that. Because, or for instance, a woman would say, I love having children. So maybe I'm doing it for myself. Said it's true, you're doing it for yourself, but you still have to have enough sense, enough mind, to say that despite the fact that this is something that's for me, this is also for God. This is also important for the world. And you need that. That's one way of understanding, like that you have to speak a certain language in your mind to be able to differentiate between what's good and what's not good, what's proper and what's not proper, what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing.
And if you don't know the language?
You have to learn it. So Tanya is a very good place to start learning this language. Because it's a language of what is my intention, why am I doing what I'm doing.
But in davening, I can't remember who said it. It said that you should daven in the language that you understand.
Oh, that's something entirely different. It's not the language I'm talking about. I'm talking about an intellectual language that helps me ask the right questions about myself.
Right.
What you're talking about is speech. You should speak, not the voice inside. The voice inside is the language. You should speak in the language that you understand. In other words, let's say that I know a number of languages, but I'm much well versed. Like the Rebbe his normal language was Yiddish, so he could articulate himself in English and in French to a degree. I don't know if you ever heard him speak French, but he knew Russian. You hear him once in a while speak Russian, and he knew Hebrew. So you hear him from once in a while speaking these languages, but these are not his regular languages. So it's different. So a person has to be careful to choose, even if I know a number of languages, choose the language that I'm well versed in, the one that comes naturally to me. So in davening, except for the Shema, or even the Shema, except for the Shmoneh Esrei, okay, even the Shema, except for the Shmoneh Esrei, a person should say everything in the language that they know. We'll go over this at some point when we get to it. כי השראת וגילוי אור אינסוף הוא בחב"ד, ואם לא היה נמשך למוחין אלו, לא היו יכולים לקבל גילוי אורו כלל. Now he's telling us why is this. Because the infinite light, the infinite revelation of Hashem first comes down into the mind. And this goes back to something we talked about two days ago, what the difference between Chabad and all the other Chassidus, Chassiduyot, what the difference is. That Chabad goes through the mind to the heart. Right? Remember we talked about this? That the Maggid said to his different students, two different paths to the heart. Because the whole point of Chassidus is to reach the heart. It's avodah shebalev. It's the work. It's the toil in the heart. So the other Rebbes, the Maggid told them, just speak directly to the heart. Leave a strong impression on a person's heart. So they could say 2-3 word Torahs, and this was enough for people to go for a year. But to the Alter Rebbe, he said, you have to get to the heart through the mind. And the reason we gave that is because this is called avodah bekoach atzmo. The person has to make himself. He can't be dependent on the Rebbe, He has to work by himself. But here he's telling us the second reason. The second reason is that the infinite revelation of Hashem can only reach the heart through the mind. Meaning, if you try to go directly through the heart, the infinite revelation can't be contained in the mind. It's not contained in the mind because the mind is limited. It's only the innermost point of the heart that can contain it. So why not go straight to the heart? That's the vessel. He says, no, if you go straight to the heart, it'll be exactly like a Rebbe talking to you. It'll make an impression for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe even for a while, but eventually it'll dissipate. But if you want this to dwell in the heart, to become something, a permanent fixture in the heart, it has to go through the mind. That's what we said, that wisdom, even though it's intellectual, because it has self-nullification, it can contain the infinite. So he says it first has to go into the mind, and then it can go into the heart. What does it mean to go into the mind? That you know the language. So again, what's the language? The language is the language that we've been learning. It's in the same way that the Tanya is talking about how my whole psychology is built. Here what we're learning is the process of the infinite revelation of Hashem coming down. And the language that we learned is that it first has to go in Shema Yisrael, Havaya Elokeinu, that's Father and Mother, that's wisdom and understanding. And only then, Havaya Echad, that's Zai Nukva. It has to first come down to the mind. That's what we learned. Now, even if you don't understand the words 100%, this is what you go to sleep with. And over time, it's like a person learning a language. You begin to you think about it. What do these words mean? What does it mean that I need my a language? The language is very simple. That before we started learning this, we didn't know that the purpose of prayer is to bring down a new revelation of Hashem. We didn't know this. And think about this. This is a new language for us. We have a whole new mindset about what prayer is. That mindset, that's the voice. That's the inner voice. That's the inner stance towards the prayer. That it's supposed to bring something new down. So we heard this in different ways. For instance, we heard Reb Nachman used to say that if a person went to daven, you should say goodbye to them. Why? Because the person who went to daven is not the person who's coming back. How good? I heard that 100 times. What does it mean? What he means to say is, in a different way, he's trying to get straight to the heart, that the purpose of prayer is to bring down a new revelation. And if it's a new revelation of the infinite, the new revelation of Hashem, so the person who's after davening is not the same person. He's a different person altogether. So now we have the language. We're beginning to understand exactly how you're going to fit it in. Every single time you're going to fit it in the same way that when a person speaks, every time the sentences are different. Even if it's the same topic, even if he says to his kids, I've told you 1,000,000 times. Okay. So even the 1,000,001th time, it's still a little bit different. So every time you go to daven, it's still a little bit different. But you have the inner voice, you have the inner language. Okay, so let's stop here.
That's also a nice parallel.